Sunday, the 29th of September 2012. And it gives me great pleasure to interview Dr. A. Gracely Mims as part of the Voicing and Action Project, which is a community-based oral narrative project with the Cleveland Justice Institute. And Dr. Mims is a singer, a voice teacher, a radio producer and host. She's been a librarian and a community volunteer as well. She has such a rich background, and she has been an integral part of Cleveland's art community. Thank you for allowing us to interview you today. I would like to begin by asking you, before you came to East Cleveland, where did you reside? Where did you grow up? Let's start in the very beginning. Where did you grow up?
Where was I born?
Where were you born? Yes.
I was born in Snow Hill, Alabama, and to a family that was involved in education very much. And there were 7 of us, 7 Lee children. And I was the 5th of the Lee children. So I'm number 5 of the 7.
And tell me about your mother and father and your grandparents. They were around?
I have quite a story about my grandfather. His name was William James Edwards. To me, he was a great man. He was born very poor and just out of slavery, so they didn't have very much, and always held his arm just so because it was something that had happened at birth. So they were very poor, but at Tuskegee Institute, Booker T. Washington, who founded Tuskegee, had sent out what we call disciples. He sent them to the black churches to tell young black men and women about Tuskegee, that they could come there if they had no money, work their way through, and get an education. So at one of the churches, St. Paul AME in Snow Hill, Alabama, there was one of his disciples telling the church members about Tuskegee. My grandfather was listening outside. He did not go in because he felt he wasn't worthy, because his clothes were not correct for church. He was too ragged, or we say in that time, raggedy. So he listened, and he was determined to go to Tuskegee. Well, he did, because he was a brilliant man. He went there, worked his way through, and when he graduated, Booker T told them in his class there was a motto that they had: deeds, not words. He told them to go back to their communities and found schools for blacks, because blacks did not have any schools at that time. My grandfather did so. There was a white gentleman on whose plantation they lived, named R.O. Simpson, and he knew that my grandfather was a brilliant young man, and he granted him some land to found this school, which my grandfather founded in a log cabin.
What was the name of the school?
Snow Hill Institute. Everything was institute at that time. Hampton Institute, Tuskegee Institute, Snow Hill Institute. And he founded this school, and it grew, and he was a wonderful principal. And unfortunately, the school, even though it thrived, was closed in the 50s due to integration. But I did want to just say that my grandfather would, as Booker T. Washington did and the people at Hampton did, he would go north to raise money for the school. At that time, let me say that the Republicans were the good guys. They had all the money. And in the South at that time, the Democrats were very, very mean to black people. We had people like Bilbo, you've heard that name in Mississippi, in Sparkman of Alabama, so forth. My grandfather, as brilliant as he was, could not vote because they had everything stacked against the black people at that time. But he would go north to raise money for Snow Hill, but he was invited to come back to Tuskegee on his 25th year of his anniversary because he asked Papa, which you called him, William James Edwards, to come back to speak because he'd done such a wonderful job at Snow Hill Institute. In the audience was Andrew Carnegie, and he wrote Papa a check for $10,000 after he heard him tell about his work at Snow Hill. At that time, that would be $100,000. It was just wonderful. So my grandfather was a great fundraiser by going north to raise school, and the school was a wonderful, all of us graduated from Snow Hill Institute, incidentally. Yes.
That's a wonderful story, very rich. You have such a rich history, and continuing the history of your family, I know that from a young age, your interest in music was piqued. Can you tell me how that happened, how that came about? What were the influences of your family?
Yes, I certainly can, because I have to go back again to my grandfather and my mother. My mother was a child prodigy. She was a beautiful pianist. And when my grandfather would go north, as I've mentioned before, to earn money for Snow Hill Institute for the foundation of it and continuation of it, he would go to Boston, for instance, and incidentally, he put himself into summer school at Harvard for a couple of summers to better himself after he'd graduated, of course, from Tuskegee. But he took my mother a couple of summers when he went to Harvard and enrolled her for summer school with a teacher at the New England Conservatory of Music. She was that talented. And he wanted her to become a concert pianist. In the meantime, when she was 18, she went to Fisk University, which was noted with the Fisk Jubilee singers who had gone to Europe and sung before Queen Victoria and had spread the spiritual there. Fisk was just the place to go for music. So he sent my mother there.
Did she go abroad when she was with them and had that opportunity? Or did
she was not there she was not in the Fisk Jubilee Singers. No, she went as a piano major. In the meantime, before she went, my father had come to Snow Hill to establish the electrical plant. My father graduated from Tuskegee Institute, and he was an electrical engineer, but he was also a musician. He played cornet and had been in the band at Tuskegee. When he came to Snow Hill to establish the electrical system in the plant and so on, he fell in love with my mother. And then, of course, we called him Papa. William James Edwards was very strict, and of course, as I said before, wanted her to be a concert pianist. So, of course, he didn't want any marriage at that time. So, what happened was, my father went to Nashville, where Fisk is, and he and my mother eloped. There was a black man there. He had a beautiful mansion, and Daddy, my father, Arnold W. Lee, made all the arrangements, went and they eloped, okay? In the meantime, my mother kept this secret from the family. She let her sister wear her ring, but finally somebody in Snow Hill, and they went around and somebody said, I heard that one of Miss Edwards' daughters got married up there in Nashville. Well, everybody knew who was up in Nashville, so the story got out. And so my mother had to admit, for about a year, she was able to keep that secret. So when they found out, then my father got a job at Spelman, and shortly thereafter, he went to Florida A&M University and became the second bandmaster. Florida A&M is known for its great bands, and my father was the second bandmaster there. and there were 7 Lees, and 3 of them were born before they came back to Snow Hill. When they came back to Snow Hill, of course, my brother Bill and I were born. Everybody else was born in Snow Hill, and we were not born in a hospital. We were born at home. But anyway, there was always music in the family. Music, music. My mother played Chopin. She played Brahms. My father was a great band man. He loved Sousa, Philip Sousa, John Philip Sousa in the bands, and he taught all of his sons to play instruments. In the meantime, my sister Consuela became a great pianist, and she, when she grew to be 18, went to Fisk University. She came back many, many years later after she'd married and come back. She came back because, as I said before, integration had closed Snow Hill Institute. She tried to reopen it as a school of the arts, and she worked for many years to do that. And my grandfather had published his own autobiography, the title of which is 25 Years in the Black Belt, and it is in the Cleveland Public Library, but of course out of print. She brought that book back into print, but with the University of Tuscaloosa, up at Tuscaloosa, University of Alabama, and wrote an epilogue, and she reprinted it. And in the meantime, just recently, my first cousin, Donald Stone, has also reprinted the book as it was at the time, with my grandfather writing the story of his founding of Snow Hill, his own story, with his picture in it and everything. But but the music part of the family was established early on because of my mother. And then Consuela was the great pianist. I loved to sing. And then I had another brother, Bill, who he went to Morehouse and learned to play the string bass. And he and my sister wrote a lot of music. They were composers as well. And we had our baby brother, we called him Baby, but his name was Clifton Lee, played trumpet and flugelhorn. We formed a folk jazz ensemble called the Descendants of Mike and Phoebe. And we traveled all over the country, including to St. Olaf College and the black colleges all over. And my brother had a group called the New York Bass Violin Choir, and my sister and I were in that also, and we went to the jazz festival, the New Jersey, New York Jazz Festival. So we had a wonderful experience. And I kept up my singing here in Cleveland as well.
So your family has been involved in the arts for so many years, and I happen to know that your nephew is Spike Lee, the film producer, director. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, that is Bill's son, the one I mentioned that went to Morehouse and plays the string bass in the Descendants of Mike and Phoebe and composed a lot of music. That is his son. He had 5 children, and Spike was the oldest one of his children, and his wife Jackie, who went to Spelman, which is the sister college of Morehouse, nicknamed him Spike. His name is Shelton Jackson Lee, but the Spike stuck for some reason, and he became famous as a filmmaker. So I'm very proud of him, very much so.
I should say so. Now you talked about your family, where you fit in, your family, and I'd like to know, what was it like for you growing up in the South?
Everything, of course, was segregated when I grew up in the South, and it was much later that the civil rights movement came along and made it possible for us to go to schools. You know, we had Vivian Malone, who we found out much later was a part of our family. That she integrated the schools at Tuscaloosa, you know, but she was a part of our family. So growing up, we knew exactly what to do. Snow Hill Institute was kind of was a haven for us. and it was a black community. Whites came into that community, our mailman and so forth, and we had a train station which was out at Snow Hill, Alabama. We were at Snow Hill Institute, Alabama, a mile away. But we went out to what we called the station. It was a train station. Train no longer goes through there, of course, now. But that's when we had interaction with whites. We knew that we didn't feel inferior because we knew that we had such a great heritage, and we were very proud of what our grandfather and our mother and our grandmother, what everybody in the family had accomplished. So we did not feel inferior, but we were not given the respect that was due, and we often had to go and sort of just kind of what we call now lay low when we went around the whites. Some of them were very nice, but some were not so nice.
Did you have some experiences you'd like to elaborate on as it related to that?
Well, as I said, we kept ourselves very much separate. In Cleveland, there was a lady who had been she was the daughter of a friend of my grandfather's. Her maiden name was Leela Duncan, and she, in her later years, was in Cleveland. She told me a story that had happened when she went to one of the white stores in Snow Hill, and a white gentleman came. He was looking for my grandmother, Mrs. Susie V. Edwards. He came into the store and asked the white gentleman who owned the store, "Where can I find Mrs. Susie V. Edwards?" And this gentleman said, "Susie V. Edwards is a nigger." So that was telling him right then, don't come here calling a black woman Mrs. This was a white gentleman who was looking for her. So that was the kind of thing that went on, because no one was given a title of respect. You had to be, they would try to find out your first name and call you by that, or they might call you Reverend, but never Mr. and Mrs. So that was the kind of thing that we went on. And I remember distinctly when I went to college, when I went to Hampton, it was Hampton Institute at the time, had to get on the train, and I went to the restroom, and in it was a white lady, and she said, "This is a white restroom. You're not supposed to be in here." So this is the kind of thing that I had to suffer, and all blacks had to suffer at that time. So it was not good. So the civil rights movement and all those people, Dr. King was a great man, Rosa Parks was a great person, and all of the others, children and young adults who fought for the right to vote and to go into restaurants and to, just be human in America was so, I just revere those people so much, even today.
Thank you for sharing that. Earlier you talked about your relationship to Vivian Malone. Would you elaborate on that? Who was she?
I did not know her at all, and it's just recently when we've done more research into our family, because Eric Holder's wife was her sister. Vivian Malone is dead now, but Eric Holder is married to her sister, and people doing research through, email and all this, internet and all this stuff, found out that they were related to our family. And so that's what I know about her. But Vivian Malone at the time was a great pioneer in breaking the color barrier.
In what area?
Getting educated in college, going to college. Yeah. She was at the University of Alabama at the time of James Meredith. Also, it was breaking the barrier in Mississippi.
Well, you certainly have explained a lot about your family as it related to living in the South. When did you make the migration north? Or when did your family, members of your family, begin to make that migration, and where did they settle?
Well, people, all of us went to college, and everybody, there was never any doubt that we were going to college, even though we didn't have any money. So everybody got scholarships or whatnot, and everybody went. So and everybody knew that they were probably not go back to Snow Hill. They went to different places. So I got my degree in library science from Cleveland. At the time, I had met my husband to be at Hampton. Both of us, Howard A. Mims, Dr. Mims, who later he passed in 2002, but he was later director of Black Studies at Cleveland State University. But we wound up here in Cleveland, and I love Cleveland very much. First, we lived in Cleveland on Stockbridge Avenue, and then we moved to East Cleveland and in the Forest Hills area, and I love it very much. We were on Glen Road in East Cleveland, and I just believe we have the perfect spot. It's just beautiful. We're near everything. We can get to Severance Hall for concerts and museums. We can get out to Severance Shopping Center. We can go in, get onto the freeways and go to the west side if we want to go there. It's just wonderful. We're in the area called Forest Hills, and this is the area that Rockefeller lived in and founded for his workers in this area. It's called Forest Hills. It's right across from Forest Hills Park, and it's just a beautiful area, and my neighbors have been very nice. I have white neighbors on both sides. Ever since we've been here, we've had one of our neighbors died and resold to another white family, and we've just been very comfortable here, and neighbors across the street are black, of course, and we're close friends of theirs. But we just, my husband and I loved East Cleveland, and I still love East Cleveland.
And can you tell me what year you moved to East Cleveland and in what ways the city has changed, if it has changed at all?
The city has changed. There aren't as many whites. As I mentioned, I've got whites on both sides of myself, and I'm sure that there's still a lot of whites still, but I know there was a migration of whites out of East Cleveland due to, unfortunately, still racism. But at one time, I know that Donald White and his wife, Donald White was the first black member of the Cleveland Orchestra, cellist. He's since died. But many of the Cleveland Orchestra members lived in East Cleveland, white. So there was a nice blend. And I never had any specific racial incidents that happened to me in East Cleveland. I've always been very, blessed. We have Neela Park with its beautiful Christmas displays, and we are close, as I said before, to Severance Hall and other places in Cleveland and Cleveland Heights and so forth. And I just, it's been a wonderful place for us, and our neighbors have been very nice.
Wonderful. So, what year was that when you moved to East?
It was during the 70s.
During the 70s, early 70s,
Late 70s.
Late 70s. And are you aware of any of the changes that have taken place in other parts of East Cleveland? And can you tell me, if you are aware of them, what contributed to those changes?
You know what? I don't think I'm not a good person to answer questions like that, because I have been so involved with my own career, and I've been involved in other areas having to do with the arts, basically, that I haven't been involved politically. I've been aware, and I know, as I mentioned before, that there has been a change, and many whites have left Cleveland, but I don't know of any specific incidents. I've kept up somewhat. I know that the city has changed. It's become basically more of a black city, and also many of the school system things have been, downgraded, and we've been challenged and so on by the Ohio Board of Education, blah, blah, blah. But I think that Shaw High School has a marvelous band. They went to China and they marched, and one of my boy students was in the pep group that went to China with the band. So there are things that we are still quite proud of here in East Cleveland.
for sharing that. You talked about racism as it related to when you were growing up. Have you experienced any racism since you've been here in East Cleveland, or any inequality, or both?
You know, Michelle, as I said before, I have not been aware of too much in East Cleveland. I remember, though, when I was head librarian at Glenville High School in Cleveland, that at the time, that was during the 60s, there was a feeling in our school that all of the top students were taken off the top of the cream of the crop, so to speak, was being sent to Collinwood rather than having them remain in Glenville, which was a black neighborhood and a black school, basically. And there was a lot of tension during that time. And you remember that was the time of the Huff riots and Harlow Jones and so on. And a lot of my school felt the racism that was prevalent in the city at the time, even in the schools, and especially in the schools. And we worked hard at Glenville against that. With Mr. Workman and Mrs. Mitchell and I, we established the Black Festival, the Black Arts Festival, and we brought in a lot of things. Dr. King spoke at Glenville. Muhammad Ali spoke at Glenville. We had wonderful things, and we had plays and art, and of course Mr. William Appling, who I sang later in his professional group, the William Appling Singers, used to be head of the music department at Glenville, and the choir was just great. They went to the World's Fair and everything, but I was also in his group. He was there at one time. Glenville was just spectacular. It was just a great school, and we had this art festival that was just beautiful, just unbelievable. And of course, the mayor, Mike White, went to Glenville, and he graduated in the late 60s, and I left in 72. And that's when we started the Descendants of Mike and Phoebe touring, and I felt I couldn't do that and remain at the library as well.
You mentioned Mr. Workman. Would that have been Hal Workman?
Absolutely. W. Hal Workman,
Yes.
great artist. Yes, we worked closely together in any way. You know, with the library, I was trying to get the books that the teachers wanted, and the kids would come in to learn how to use the library. It was just wonderful. And the Black festivals were wonderful. We had Quiz 100 that I formed, and the kids would come in. We had gone to the community to get prizes for the kids so that they would have them and learn about their history. It was divided in terms of history and arts and, you know, all of the literature like Langston Hughes and Paul Laurence Dunbar and so on. It was just a wonderful thing that we had. And we called it Eusi Sikuku, which was our Swahili for black arts.
Nice, very nice. Now, Glenville was on the border of Cleveland and East Cleveland. During that time, did you have any recollection of East Cleveland? Anything you knew about East Cleveland at the time?
You know, actually, Glenville was not on the border of East Cleveland. It was, you know, on the border near Collinwood, near that neighborhood. But East Cleveland was quite a little distance away from Glenville. But I didn't know of anything happening at the time in East Cleveland. It could have been that I just wasn't aware, was so involved in what I was doing at Glenville in Cleveland at the time. I know that Cleveland had a lot of racial things happening, and I don't know whether East Cleveland was so much involved in that or not.
And you earlier talked about inequality as it related to when you were a librarian at Glenville. and I can see how that could impact the city. Now I'd like for you to recollect a memory or instance where the community of East Cleveland fought for something.
Well, I think that the community has been very much involved with its own library, and Greg Reese, who was head of the library, had a marvelous, and the auditorium is named for him. Uh, there was a family that contributed a lot to the um, expansion of the library, but a white family. And now I think the people wanted East Cleveland. I think they had to close a branch of the library, and the main library where we had Greg Reese had the beautiful concerts and jazz concerts and so on. Um, I think that the board decided they wanted to join the Cuyahoga County for greater visibility and financial security. And some of the community fought against that. So I know that's been one of the main struggles. I'm aware of. Being a librarian, of course, I'm interested in that.
And tell me about the surrounding institutions and the surrounding cities and how you feel that it impacted East Cleveland.
Well, I think it's been to our advantage to be here. We're close to Cleveland, and our Mayor Gary Norton, has promoted the relationship between University Circle. That's where we're close. That's near us. That's been a relationship there. Cleveland Heights is just intertwined with East Cleveland, Cleveland Heights. I believe half of my street even is Cleveland Heights. And we have the park system. Part of it's East Cleveland, part of it's Cleveland Heights. It's just wonderful to have this kind of relationship. And I think that the more that our students can, be commingled with the other suburbs is a positive thing.
What is your vision for a future East Cleveland? And tell me about the major issues that need addressing in order to better East Cleveland, the community, the city.
Everybody is concerned these days about money, and of course we are very much involved in that. I'm not quite sure how our tax system is going to be related, but we certainly need to pay adequate taxes so that our garbage pickup and all that kind of thing. So far, so good. We haven't been, impacted negatively in terms of that. And I think that some of the housing in the areas other than Forest Hills may certainly be having some problems with abandoned homes and that kind of thing, and some crime in the area. So we do have our little traffic stops, that help to raise money for the city. But hopefully, but East Cleveland is very good. They usually warn you, that you are approaching an area where you might be ticketed. And so I think that we need to continue to upgrade our housing so that abandoned houses are not there anymore, are torn down, or our areas are people come in and live in homes in the area, because East Cleveland is a beautiful city, and it's well situated. And I think that those of us who have made our home here certainly want to keep it safe and want to keep it progressing.
What would you personally be prepared to to do to participate in making East Cleveland better?
You know, at this point in time, I think that what I can do is to maintain my own property in the way that it should be maintained. I am not so much a person who's involved politically. I've been involved very much with other things, mostly having to do with the arts. I'm I've just recently been appointed an honorary trustee of the Cleveland Museum of Art. I've been for quite a while a trustee of the Cleveland Institute of Music, on which I serve on 2 committees. That keeps me hopping. I have been on the Rainey Institute board. I was one of the founders of the African American organization at the Western Reserve Historical Museum of Archives of Black History. So I have been involved, but basically with my singing, my singing career is over because you know, if you're a soprano, you get so old you can't sing anymore. People don't want to hear you anymore. I'll put it that way. But I'm still teaching, and I still have my radio show. And in 1976, I decided to call Robert Conrad, who was the president of WCLV. They had beautiful programming. It was a classical music station, the home of the Cleveland Orchestra, which is one of the greatest orchestras in the world. And on that program, they had the Catholic hour and the Jewish hour, but they had nothing about black people. So I called Bob Conrad and I said, you know, we have such beautiful black musicians, singers, composers, pianists. There's Marian Anderson, there's Paul Robeson, there's Roland Hayes, there's Leontine Price, there's Kathleen Battle, there's Jesse Norman, and there is Andre Watts and composers like William Grant Still, and I went on. And he said, well, come in and talk to me about it. WCLV was down at Terminal Tower at the time. I went down and talked to Bob Conrad. He said, do a trial program for me. I did a trial program on Jesse Norman. He liked it. And he said, I would like to have you do this program and insert in it a Black Arts calendar, talking about what's going on at Caramoo, what concerts are featuring black artists, and all that kind of stuff in the program for an hour. And I began that program. He said, you've got to be willing to do this for me for 6 months, Grace. I said, wonderful. I've been there 36 years. The Black Arts on WCLV 104.9 FM, and I love it. So I'm busy. I'm busy with the art, so I don't get to do a lot of other volunteer work. So I hope I'm forgiven for that.
Well, you certainly do your share, more than your fair share, in terms of educating the community, in terms of working with the community. I know that there's been a number of artists that you have worked with and have gone on to do wonderful things. So you are definitely a contributor, and one that I certainly hold in high esteem and have for years.
Thank you so much. And I am so honored that Cleveland has honored me. I have received an honorary Doctor of Music from Cleveland State University. I've had other wonderful honors from black organizations, too numerous to even mention. But I really do appreciate that people have, and I hope they will continue to listen to my show, and they remember me from Glenville High School. And also I was young adult librarian at Mount Pleasant Branch Library.
You certainly, we could probably go on and on. I'm sure after this interview you're going to think of some wonderful things that you've done. And if you do, we can continue the interview. But for today, I just want to thank you for agreeing. Thank you for signing the consent form so that we can go forward with the interview. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Mims, could you tell me about your childhood when you grew up? I know you told me you were one of 7 children, but I want to know a little bit more about you and your siblings and how it was growing up.
Well, you know, Snow Hill, Alabama, was in the country. So I didn't have this city upbringing. We just played, we made up games, we did games, hide and seek, that kind of thing. And being a part of a large family, I didn't have to go very far to look for playmates. We were family and we played together. Uh, as I said, music was such an important part of our lives, but the school was also an important part of our lives. And we looked forward every fall to school starting because those teachers were wonderful. And I remember Mr. Wilson was the principal when I was there, and Miss Johnson was a 6th grade teacher, and she was kind of the matron of the whole school. And she kept everybody under the strict regimen, so everybody was sort of afraid of her. When we kept, we towed the line there. But in school, it was wonderful. I loved school. I was a good student. I was a valedictorian of my school. And at that time, I'm pretty sure that helped me to get into Hampton. And Papa had made the school a boarding school. So there were students there in the dormitories that had been built by people who had contributed and so on. And I remembered one year that a girl came there, and everybody in the community called all of the Lee children by their names so that they would be distinguished. You were talking about Grace Lee, Consuelo Lee, Bill Lee, Clarence Lee, Arnold Lee, Leonard Lee, Clifton Lee. Everybody said the Lees. So this young lady heard people calling me Grace Lee. So she came up to me and she said, "What is your last name? Grace Lee what?" And I said, "Well, Lee is my last name." And so therefore, I thought about that. I said, if I put, because I'm named for my mother, and I don't tell anybody what that A is for. I said, jokingly, I said, it's Amazing Grace. But anyway, I said, if I put that A there, they will know that Lee is my last name, because it's very common in the South for Lee, Kathy Lee, this and that and the other. But Lee may be a second name, middle name. And so I started that in high school, signing my name, A. Grace Lee. And I went to college, and everybody was saying, "Who is this A. Grace Lee? Who is this person who uses her middle name instead of her?" And so that was a point that, distinguished me. And so I kept that. Even when I married Howard, I kept the A. Grace Lee Mims. And so it all goes back to Snow Hill and that girl asking me, "What's your last name?"
Wow, wonderful. What was it like in church? I mean, a lot of black families started singing in church, or tell me about your family's background and your background with church, your affiliations over the years.
We belong to the AME denomination, Methodist, African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was founded by Richard Allen. Um, and my grandfather turned out to be a wonderful speaker. The lady I told the story about, Mrs. Duncan, said that Martin Luther King reminded her of my grandfather. He was such a great orator, so wonderful orator. Snow Hill Institute was the center of our lives because Papa had Vesper services. And at the Vesper services, we had good music. We had the choir, the high school choir, and we had wonderful speakers sometimes, my grandfather and so on. So the Vespers were very important. And of course, the church was important to us on Sunday. But our church had people, for instance, from further back who shouted and did things like that, but our family didn't. And we felt that scripture in the Bible that says you can go inside your closet and pray. We believed in that. And my grandfather, my grandmother, none of us, we didn't do this loud shouting and waving of hands and things like that. So that's what I remember about our church, that basically every Sunday evening we had Vespers at Snow Hill Institute. And that was a beautiful time for us to worship with the music, and with the message. And we also worshiped on Sunday morning at St. Paul's, AME Church.
So when you moved up north, what was your church family?
It's still the AME. I wanted to still remain an African Methodist Episcopal Church person because my family was reared that way. And I joined St. James, that's what I almost said, St. James AME under Reverend Donald Jacobs, who was a great, great minister. He was very quiet, but his message was very relevant. And he went with Rabbi Lillaville south to march during the Civil Rights era. And my neighbor, Emma Benning, at the time I lived on Stockbridge, was a member there, and she persuaded Howard and me to join there, and we did, and that's where I still have my membership.
Good. Now you also, from what I understand, have two people before, another person besides Reverend Jacobs, who you also hold dear to your heart. Would you like to elaborate?
That is the Reverend Otis Moss Jr. and Reverend Marvin McMickle, who are both Baptists, and if I hadn't been so involved with AME, I probably would have joined one of their churches, because I think they are wonderful ministers. They're both, Reverend McMickle is gone to head up a divinity school or seminary, and Reverend Moss is retired. But I had Reverend Moss do the eulogy for my husband when he passed, because I thought Reverend Moss is such a wonderful minister and such a great sense of humor. All of this is part of it, and they're so relevant, they're so well read, and I just love that in both of those ministers. Actually, my sister Consuelo, when she passed, they had my cousin Augusta in New York as a member of the Abyssinian Baptist Church there, which was Adam Clayton Powell's church. When he died or left, Samuel Proctor took over. When he left, there were two assistant ministers there, and the church had to decide which one to call. And they called Reverend Calvin Butts. The other minister was Reverend Marvin McMickle, who came to Cleveland. So those, and I do have a relationship with Calvin Butts because of my cousin, and he was at the memorial for Consuelo, which was held in New York, because she would take her group that she had formed at Snow Hill, Bright Glory, and they played xylophone and played jazz, and he knew her well, and her memorial was there at that church in New York.
One of my memories in education was your husband, Howard A. Mims, who was one of my professors and a professor of my oldest sister and my sister under me. And I'd like for you to tell me, you mentioned that you met at Hampton, and I wanted to know some more about him, what he did, some of the positions that he held. So would you please elaborate?
Howard was just wonderful, and I'm still always getting his former students from Cleveland State coming up to me to tell me how great he was and how they loved him at Cleveland State. Howard looked out for the black students at Cleveland State. They knew that they could go to him and they would find a friend and an advocate. and he was in the he was at the time of his uh, when he got ill, he was director of Black Studies, but also in the Department of Speech and Hearing. He had gone to Wayne State University after we graduated from Hampton and gotten his degree, master's in speech. Then he went to Case Western Reserve at the time, and got his doctorate, master's and doctorate in speech pathology. And so he was in the speech pathology department, which has established a scholarship in his name as well. He and I both have a scholarship that we give to Hampton, to our alma mater of Hampton, of $1,000 to a Cleveland area student every year. Incidentally, I have also established the A. Grace Lee Mims Vocal Scholarship with the Cleveland Foundation of $10,000 to a black student in Ohio who's going in voice to study beyond the bachelor degree, the master's or doctorate, $10,000 scholarship. But they must agree to either sing or teach the spiritual, because I want to see that the spiritual survives, that we do not lose it. And we're beginning, I love gospel, but we're beginning in our churches to sing only gospel and not the spiritual. So our concert artists are keeping it alive, and our black colleges are keeping the spiritual alive, and I want to do that. But Howard was certainly a wonderful person. The Cultural Center at Cleveland State University is named for him. It is the Howard A. Mims African American Cultural Center, and he was just outstanding. That's all I can say. And I miss him so much because he was just a beautiful, beautiful man.
What is, like for young people who don't know about the spirituals, what would you tell them? And do you have anything interesting to say about any particular spiritual, or what your favorite spirituals are?
It's very hard for me to indicate what my favorite spiritual is, but I'm a firm believer in those people who were arrangers of the spiritual having their works continue. We had such great people. Now, just a little story here. Antonin Dvorak, the great Czech composer who wrote the New World Symphony, came over here. They brought him over to start a school of, to head the School of Music in New York. It was called the American Conservatory at the time. It is now Juilliard. Okay, from Erie, Pennsylvania, went Harry T. Burleigh, who was black, of course, born in Erie. His grandfather had been a slave, and he knew all the spirituals. He was the lamp lighter in Erie. He would go around lighting the lamps in Erie, Pennsylvania, taking his little grandson, Harry, along with him, and he was singing spirituals, and Harry Burleigh learned all these spirituals. He had a beautiful baritone voice, and some white friends sent him to New York to further his education in the American Conservatory under Antonin Dvorak. Antonin Dvorak heard these spirituals. He heard Burleigh. He would have Burleigh come to his apartment and sing these spirituals. And he said, "This is the music of America." And he put, "Going home, I am going home." That was the theme of the New World Symphony that he wrote as a spiritual, you know, taking off from Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. And he told Burleigh to arrange these for your people. Well, Burleigh arranged all these beautiful spirituals. Marian Anderson sang them, Paul Robeson sang, and they are still, I teach from the book of Burleigh spirituals at the Cleveland Music School settlement to this day because it's so beautiful. We have other arrangers like at Tuskegee, William L. Dawson, choral music for black choruses. And we had at Hampton, R. Nathaniel Dett, who discovered Dorothy Maynor, who was a great soprano. And then we had Moses Hogan, who went to Oberlin. They thought he was going to be a piano star because he won the Kosciuszko piano competition, but he went back to New Orleans, his home, and established a chorus and began composing, arranging all these spirituals for the Moses Hogan Chorale, which became the Moses Hogan Singers. Don't you know he died of a brain tumor? So that's one reason I established that scholarship, because I said I've got to put my money where my mouth is. I'm not rich, but I wanted to do something to preserve that, because we have to preserve that spiritual. And these arrangers were the ones who did it, and there were many wonderful women arrangers too, Florence Price and Margaret Bonds and so on. Just wonderful. And if we hear that music, which was born out of slavery, but yet our people were so talented. They brought these people from Africa. They were talented. You hear me? They were beautiful. They built all this wrought iron in New Orleans, and they built the White House, and they were musical, and they created the spiritual and this beautiful music that they were looking up to heaven. You know, every time I feel the spirit, I will pray and swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. All this beautiful music. And we should not lose it. We as black people have got to preserve that. So this is what I'm about.
I love the passion. Absolutely. Um, this has just been wonderful. It's been very rich, very filling for me. And music fills my soul. History fills my soul. And today, you have filled my soul. Thank you.
Thank you.
That'd be great. So you can do it now, since you have that. And I think, oh, good, you found wonderful things.
Is that it, honey?
That's it.
Okay.